Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. Well, would you believe it? With this episode, we mark a year of the Banner magazine podcast. We hope it's been helpful to you. Before we read the articles for today, I thought it might be of interest to review some of the most popular episodes from the past 12 months, based on the number of downloads and listens. The top 5 from January to June were as follows. The 5th most listened to episode was J.I. Packer on Puritan Evangelism, Part 1. Number 4 was Coming Events and Present Duties by J.C. Ryle. The 3rd most popular was Christianity and Freemasonry. The 2nd, perhaps unsurprisingly, was The King's Business Requireth Haste, introducing the Banner magazine podcast. And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, the most popular from the first 6 months of the year was our Mark Dever interview. When it came to the second half of the year, the 5th most popular episode was The Bountiful Blessing of Biblical Meditation. The 4th was the Stuart Olliott interview. The 3rd, The Believer's Duty in a Dark Day. The 2nd most popular, and one which seemed to really resonate with many listeners, was Growth, Grumbling, and Gospel Unity, with the article from Paul Levy. And the most popular was Eric Liddell and the Freedom of the Sabbath. Now, I should note that this isn't a strictly scientific measure because the episodes have all had different lengths of time in which to gather listens and downloads, but I hope it gives you some idea as to what has been popular with our listeners this year. Many thanks to the listeners who have given us feedback in various forms and left reviews in various places. And of course, if you haven't left a rating or a review and would like to, that would be hugely helpful to us and help others to discover us, particularly if you could leave a comment about what people can expect to hear on the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. With that all said, onwards and upwards. This week, we've got 2 articles from W.J. Grier, a former minister in the Evangelical Presbyterian Church in Ireland. The first article is called The Closing Year. And it is not, contrary to what may be supposed, about the close of the year, but about the final year of John Calvin's life. In an earlier episode, Calvin in France, we read an excerpt from W.J. Grier's book on John Calvin, covering Calvin's early ministry, so it is perhaps fitting that we close out the year by considering Calvin's final days. It was a Sabbath day, 19th of December, 1562. And Calvin was confined to bed with gout. The north wind had been blowing for 2 consecutive days with great violence. Calvin, in the hearing of several persons, said, "I know not what the cause of it is, but during the night I thought I heard martial music sounding aloud, and could not persuade myself that it was not really so. Let us pray, I beseech you, for some matter of great moment is going forward." It turned out that this was the day of the fierce battle of Dreux in France. The cause of the sorely tried French Protestants lay on Calvin's heart, and from his bed of weakness, he was their counselor and spiritual captain. His premonition on this occasion was marvelous, but not without parallel. His bodily weakness was increasing, for he took no rest of mind or spirit. He was struggling against a multitude of ailments, indigestion, colic, gout, etc. On the 5th of June, 1563, he preached, but was, Beza tells us, amazingly exhausted by the effort. Some months later, Beza speaks of him as having been afflicted with gallstone, and then, for a month, battling against an attack of gout. Beza later adds, "I never look at him, and I see him every day, without needing solace." Yet all this time, Calvin kept toiling on, especially with correspondence. He wrote 2 very serious admonitions to the believers in Poland, warning against the anti-Trinitarian errors which were springing up there. In this last year of his life, there were 12 letters to Bullinger of Zurich, and letters to the Queen of Navarre, the Duchess of Ferrara, the Prince of Condé, Admiral Coligny, and others in various ranks of life. In his last illness, when suffering from breathlessness and almost unable to move, he translated his Harmony of Moses from Latin into French, revised his translation of Genesis, wrote his commentary on Joshua, and corrected the greater part of his annotations on the New Testament. When Beza and other friends advised him to desist from writing, he replied that what he was doing was as nothing, and added, "What? Would you have the Lord to find me idle?" He wished to watch and work as far as he could till his last breath. Toward the end of 1563, the gout gave him some respite, and he used the opportunity to give his lectures and to preach, being carried in a chair to the church. He even visited his friends to cheer their hearts. In Beza's Life of Calvin, we read, "The year 1564 was to him the commencement of perpetual felicity, and to us of the greatest grief." Though all was peaceful and orderly within the city of Geneva, the political horizon was growing darker. Beza wrote that, with the return of the Cardinal of Lorraine from Trent, hosts of new devils threaten France. They also threatened Geneva, which the Roman Church regarded as the source of most of its troubles. For Calvin, the end was slowly drawing near. On the 2nd of February, he gave his last sermon on the books of Kings, and the same afternoon he gave his last lecture in the college on the book of Ezekiel. On Sabbath, 6th of February, he gave his last sermon on the harmony of the three Gospels. He never entered the pulpit again, though he still tried to go to the meetings of the congregation on Fridays and say a few words and offer the closing prayer. This he did, in spite of his doctors and friends, because there was no need to speak at length, and because he took pleasure in it. Actually, he could not speak at length because of shortness of breath. Sometimes his body was so weak that he had strength only to take a few steps. But at times he had some alleviation. He knew the end was not far off, and often he repeated, "O Lord, how long?" The news of his declining strength spread abroad. Spina wrote to him saying that he had heard that it was only his spirit which remained, his body being only a skeleton. "Your strength," he said, "has been sapped by your toils, and what remains is consumed by your care for the churches." On the 6th of March, 1564, Beza wrote that his bodily sufferings increased during the previous month. On the 10th of March, some of the pastors from the city and the neighborhood visited him. They found him dressed and seated by his table, gasping for breath. He remained for a time without speaking, with his head resting on one of his hands, a common posture with him. Then he looked pleasantly at them and thanked them for their visit and the trouble they had taken. He said he hoped to be with them at the meeting of the consistory for private censures a fortnight later, but that it would be the last time. "I believe this will be my end, and that God will take me." The same day, the council of the city, hearing that he was so seriously ill, decided that all of them pray for his health, that the magistrates visit him often, and that a present of 25 gold pieces be given him. But he could not be induced to receive it, as he had not worked for it. The very day before his death, he preached another grand sermon, refusing his salary on the same grounds. He was able to be at the consistory on the 24th of March. It was held in his house, and though it lasted for 2.5 hours, he did not seem exhausted. At the close, he went on to read some of his marginal notes on the New Testament and asked their opinions. The next day, however, he was worse. On the 27th, he had himself carried to the town hall, the scene of many of his battles and triumphs, and presented to the council the new rector of the school, and went on to deliver his last address there, thanking them for their kindness shown in his illness. He spoke with great difficulty, but with marvellous charm of manner. "I feel that I am now in this place for the last time," he said. The members of the council were affected, even to tears. On the 28th, he was present for the last time at the consistory. The same day, Zanchius, in a letter to Beza, sent greetings to Calvin, whom he speaks of as mortally ill. Zanchius wrote to Bullinger, "If the Lord takes away Calvin, what can we say but that he is angry with us because of our ingratitude?" On Easter Sabbath, the 2nd of April, he had himself carried to church and received the Lord's Supper from the hands of Beza. In spite of difficulty of breathing, he joined in the singing of the psalm, his face alight with joy. He was now too feeble to write, though he still continued to dictate. Beza told Bullinger, "His thin, feeble body is so worn out that he could not endure any remedy. You can understand, my father, in what grief we are plunged here." On the 25th of April, Calvin made his will. It is full of gratitude to God and confidence in his redeeming grace. He wished to live and die in the faith God had given him. He made his beloved brother Anthony his heir, but in the way of honor only. He bequeathed to him a silver cup. To the boys' school he gave 10 gold pieces, and gold pieces to his brother's children and another relative. His friend Lawrence of Normandy was named with his brother as executor. His whole estate was small. The above legacies were to be realized from the sale of his books and effects. On the 27th of April, the council was informed that he was sick unto death, and that he wished to appear before them yet once more. They were eager to spare him the labour, and decided to go to his house to hear what he had to say. He told them, when they appeared, that he had deferred this last interview till he had a surer presentiment of his decease. He spoke to them most movingly, of his battles, of his sometimes too great vehemence, of his preaching of the pure word of God, and of their support and forbearance. He warned them that Satan would stir up wicked men to corrupt the pure doctrine. Finally, he prayed for them and gave his right hand to each. They withdrew in tears, as if each was taking a last sorrowful farewell of his own father. On the 28th of April, the ministers came to him at his request. In his address to them, he surveyed the past years. "When I first came to this church, there was practically nothing. All was in confusion. I have lived here in marvellous combats. I have been saluted in mockery on an evening by 50 or 60 gunshots before my door. They set dogs on me, which seized me by the coat and legs. I went to the council of 200, 17th of December 1547, when they were fighting among themselves, keeping back others who wished to go. When some shouted, 'Withdraw!' I replied, 'I shall not. Go on, villains, kill me, and my blood will witness against you, and these benches require it at your hands. Although I am nothing, I have suppressed 3,000 tumults which would have arisen in Geneva. Be strong and of good courage.' He took farewell of all, and shook hands with each. All were melted to tears. On the 2nd of May, 1564, this peerless letter-writer wrote his last letter. Fittingly, it was to his old friend Farel. He had heard that Farel, now in his 80th year and feeble, wished to come to see him. He wrote him in Latin. Farewell, my best and most right-hearted brother. I would not have you fatigue yourself on my account. I draw my breath with difficulty, and am daily waiting till I altogether cease to breathe. It is enough that to Christ I live and die. To his people he is gain in life and death. I commend you to God. Entirely yours, John Calvin. In spite of the weight of his years, Farel did not let this letter stop him. He came to Geneva, and after seeing Calvin and conversing with him, and preaching in the congregation, he returned to his church in Neuchâtel. On the 4th of May, Beza wrote to Bullinger of the success of the schools in Geneva, with nearly 1,500 scholars, and went on to mention the continual suffering of our beloved father. He gave us in life a model of devotion, said Beza, and now in death a singular example of Christian fortitude. On the 13th of May, Calvin's secretary, Genvilliers, wrote with grief and tears of him as crushed with pains most diverse and dreadful. Beza heard him say on one occasion, "Thou, O Lord, bruisest me, but it is enough for me that it is thy hand." On the 24th of May, Beza wrote to Bullinger, "Our Calvin from day to day hastens on more and more to the eternal peace. The day before yesterday, I greeted him in your name, and I mentioned the earnest prayers of your church for him." Beza added that Calvin replied, "I thank those most excellent brethren. Lord, keep these faithful servants, and hear them, but if it please thee, let me soon be with thee." Beza tells us that in his severe sufferings, Calvin showed astonishing patience, and was continually longing after God, and lifting his eyes to him. "As for us," says Beza, "we mourn as orphans." May the 19th was the day for the ministers to meet for their private censures and dine together. Calvin allowed them to have supper at his house, and collecting all his strength, he was carried in a chair from his bed to the next room. On entering, he said, "I come to you, brethren, for the last time. I am never again to sit at table." He offered a prayer and sought cheerfully to take a little food. Before the meal was over, he was carried back to his room, saying with a smile, "Though this wall is between us, I shall be with you in spirit." From that day, he never rose from his bed. His face was unchanged. Indeed, his very looks bore witness to his faith. But owing to weakness and shortness of his breath, his prayers and consolations were breathed rather in sighs than in intelligible words. On the day of his death, the 27th of May, 1564, he seemed to be stronger and to speak with less difficulty, but it was nature's last effort. In the evening, about 8 o'clock, without a single convulsion or even a deeper sigh, calmly his spirit passed from the emaciated body. Beza says, "He remained perfectly sensible, and was not deprived of utterance to his very latest breath. Indeed, he looked much more like one sleeping than dead." On that day, then, at the same time with the setting sun, this splendid luminary was withdrawn from us. A few days later, the funeral took place, attended by the senators, pastors, and almost the whole city, many in tears. He was buried, says Beza, in the common cemetery, with no extraordinary pomp, and, as he had commanded, without any gravestone. He was but 54 years of age. The only epitaph he would have wished was this: "To God alone the glory." That piece, The Closing Year by W.J. Grier, was featured in the December 2010 issue of the magazine, number 567. For For our second reading today, and our last of the year, we turn to another piece by Grier. This one called On Toward the Goal, a meditation for the new year. It appeared in the January 1984 issue of the magazine, number 244. In the epistle to the Philippians, the Apostle Paul declares that his thoughts and purposes are concentrated on one thing. I press on toward the goal, he says, Philippians 3:13-14. He is picturing himself as a runner, striving with might and main in the Christian race. 1. Concentration. Here we have concentration on one great object, the attainment of the goal. The psalmist prayed for such concentration of aim and endeavor when he cried, "Unite my heart to fear thy name." Says Dr. Alexander McLaren, "It is only God who is great enough to fill and engage all our capacities. Only the mass of the central sun is weighty enough to make giant orbs its satellites, and to wheel them in their courses. There is no tranquility, nor any power in lives frittered away on 1,000 petty loves. The river that breaks into a multitude of channels is sucked up in the sand without reaching the ocean, and has no force in its current to scour away obstructions. Concentration makes strong men. Consecration makes saints. This one thing I do is the motto of all who have done anything worthy." We have a magnificent example of such concentrated devotion in the life of Athanasius, 293-373 AD. Philip Schaff, the historian, says of him that he was a man of one mould and one idea, and all else was subordinated to this. His passion and life work was to vindicate the deity of his Lord. When the tide was running strongly against him at a great council of the church, someone said to him, "You are fighting a losing battle. Does Athanasius not know that the whole world is against him?" With the light of high resolve in his eye, Athanasius quietly replied, "Is the world against Athanasius? Then Athanasius is against the world." Time and again he went in peril of his life. For nearly 47 years he was Bishop of Alexandria, and he spent some 20 of these in exile. Tilemon speaks of his many troubles and dangers as a continual martyrdom. But he was utterly convinced that it was infinitely worthwhile to go through any amount of work and suffering in defense of such a truth and in the cause of such a master. And the truth for which he contended so ably and faithfully was victorious in the end. Even Edward Gibbon said of him that he was a splendid example of what effect may be produced, what obstacles may be surmounted by the force of a single mind when it is inflexibly applied to the pursuit of a single object. May our lives not be frittered away in the days ahead on a multitude of petty things. May we rather be much in the main things. May we concentrate on the goal, on the glory of God and the bliss of heaven. 2. Enthusiasm. Paul's zeal in running the race is plain. It was something he learned from his master. Our Lord came for our salvation, clad with zeal as a cloak. His disciples, as they looked on him in the course of his earthly ministry, could see the word of the psalmist fulfilled in him. "The zeal of thy house hath eaten me up." Psalm 69:9, John 2:17. The psalmist himself had this spirit in measure. Dr. Alexander White says of him, "David never did anything by halves. Energy, decision, resolution, devotion, finish, scorn of idleness, scorn of ease, love of labor, love of danger. You will always find virtues like these in young David." Chrysostom describes Paul as an insatiable, greedy, devouring worshipper of God. Chrysostom himself exhibited this zeal for God in an eminent degree. It is said of him that he regarded himself as the bearer of momentous truth, and soared above human praise, and forgot himself in his cause, and that cause the salvation of souls. Remember the dying Covenanter, cruelly slain by Claverhouse's dragoons. Weltering in his own blood, he cried out with his last breath, "Though every hair on my head were a man, I would die all those deaths for Christ and his cause." Oh, for more zeal for the Lord and his good cause in the days ahead. May each one of us be able to say, "Loved of my God, for him again, with love intense I burn. Chosen of him ere time began, I choose him in return." 3. Anticipation. Chrysostom says that the runner does not count how many laps he has completed, but how many laps remain. In other words, his eyes are on the goal. I press toward the goal. Charles Simeon of Cambridge, when near the end of his course, wrote in one of his last letters, "I am so near the goal that I cannot help running with all my might. Press onward, look upward, be strong in the Lord. Our hope in his mercy, our trust in his word. Press forward, look upward, march homeward and sing. All glory to Jesus our King." Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.